so much, and it's a real honor to be on this panel and to speak after the pastor whose views and whose words I echo and endorse wholeheartedly. If I may, I would like to begin by giving some background, because I often think it's when we look at these live streamed pictures of starvation, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, it's easy to forget how we got here. And of course, Raphael Lemkin, the man who coined the phrase genocide, was very clear that genocide is a continuum. It's not a one-off act. It's something that goes on and on. And if we look at what the context is for Gaza, 66% of people in Gaza are refugees or descendants of refugees, which makes them refugees themselves, from 1948. So they fled or were forced to flee their homes in 1948, and they took refuge in Gaza, which is why there are so many refugee camps in Gaza where UNRWA has its operations. So that's the first part of the context, the dispossession of two-thirds of Gaza in 1948. Then we have the occupation, which began in 1967, and the consequent deprivations that we saw of land being confiscated, of the wholesale denial of rights and of human dignity. And then we move on to 2007, which is when the blockade of Gaza was imposed almost totally, both in terms of goods going in. So UNRWA, that I used to work for, we would have to have every can of tinned food cleared by the Israelis, everything. And of course, that then became a bottleneck, which the occupation authorities could use to strangle Gaza. And since the 7th of October 2023, what we've seen is an almost total strangulation. At times, there have been months where literally nothing has gone into Gaza. And let us not forget that Gaza has a fence built around it. It's unique in the annals of contemporary warfare in being a war zone where there is nowhere safe. There's nowhere safe to run. They cannot escape. And in that context, we now have the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation delivering aid in what is effectively an agricultural cattle area fenced off, where people come like cattle, and indeed they're being slaughtered like cattle at the rate of about 50 people a day in the 6 or more weeks since the GHF has been operational, about 1,000 people, and that's not very much less than the number of people who were killed in the October the 7th attack. Let's not forget that. But whereas there was huge global outrage for the October 7th attack, there's so little outrage or meaningful outrage. So that's the context. I'd like to pick up on what the Reverend said about accountability, because I think accountability is an area where we can meaningfully talk of something that we can do beyond words. And there are three levels of accountability, I would say. There's the international court, so both the ICJ, the International Court of Justice in The Hague, and the International Criminal Court, also in The Hague. The International Criminal Court, it did issue arrest warrants for 3 Hamas leaders who have now been killed by the Israelis, but there are open arrest warrants for the former Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Galant, and Benjamin Netanyahu. It is an obligation on all 123 state parties to the court, to the ICC, to arrest and hand over these 2 men if ever they fly over their airspace or come across borders into their jurisdiction. So that's one area. The other part of international justice is the ICJ, where the South African government has taken a case accusing the Israeli government of violating the Genocide Convention. And I would like to see more member states of the United Nations coming forward and supporting that. On the 26th of January last year, the court, the ICJ, imposed what are called provisional measures, including the full humanitarian access. So the court demanded that Gaza effectively should be flooded with aid. And what we've seen is the absolute reverse. And state parties have an obligation to make sure that those provisional measures are implemented. And if they fail to, then they themselves open themselves up to possible sanctions and other measures. So I think point number one, those mechanisms need to be activated. We all need to be saying to our elected representatives, what are you doing as state parties to the Rome Statute to make sure that these provisional measures are implemented and that Gaza is flooded with aid? Secondly, we need to support the universal jurisdiction measures which are being taken by some extraordinary Palestinian groups themselves, such as the Hind Rajab group based in Brussels, which have been looking at the social media postings, very arrogant postings of Israeli soldiers who film themselves doing selfies of, blowing up housing blocks, blowing up civilians, going into homes, looting wardrobes, and all of those sort of things are there and online, and we need to make sure that governments support and prosecution authorities support these individual efforts to bring the Israelis to accountability. Because if we can send a powerful signal that people who perpetrate these appalling atrocity crimes will be prosecuted, then at least there's some even minimal hope that in the future other would-be criminals perhaps might be deterred. And then very lastly, on accountability, I think we have to look at the recent and very brilliant report of the UN rapporteur for the situation of human rights in occupied Palestine, Francesca Albanese. Her report, which is entitled From the Economy of Occupation to the Economy of Genocide, names and shames specific universities, companies and other entities that are profiteering from the genocide. And we need to make sure that her recommendations, Francesca's excellent recommendations, are fully implemented. And again, we need to make sure that our elected representatives are aware that we, the people, are looking at what they're doing in terms of blockading Israel, making sure that there's no military support for the genocide. And I want to end with one final observation, and it's very much in line with what the Reverend was saying about never again. What we're now seeing is the army of a people against whom the absolutely appalling events of the Second World War, the Holocaust, were perpetrated. And that very army is now, frankly, doing things which are chillingly redolent and reminiscent of what happened during the Second World War. Indeed, Ehud Olmert, the former Israeli prime minister, is on record as saying that Israel is creating a concentration camp in southern Gaza. That's what he said. So, let us be very careful, because the motto of all of that was never again. And yet the very army of the people against whom that was perpetrated are themselves showing that never again is really not worth the paper it's printed on. And as we've been hearing on this panel, if we are able to hold our heads high and say to the next generation, this will never happen again, then we have to look at our own actions and ask ourselves the question, what are we doing now to make sure this does not happen? And I've given, I think, some pointers as to what we have to do to make sure that we can truly live up to this idea of never again. It also applies to the Palestinians, and it applies to the children who are being killed, starved to death at the rate of at least 20 a day. Thank you so much.